Hi, my name's Luke Toohill and I'm the Director here at Mia Child and Family Study Centre with a demonstration early childhood program at Macquarie University. Learning environments are a really important part of what we do as early childhood educators, and the way the environment's set up has been a real interest of mine throughout my career, and I think I'm really fascinated by the way that the environment shapes how children behave but also how we behave as adults. Having said that though, I think the thing to acknowledge really early on is the environment's not actually the most important part of what we do. In that sense, while we're going to talk about environments today, we're really talking about environments in terms of what they enable us to do as educators rather than what they do purely on their own terms. So I think the thing to think about is we're really talking about the environment as being kind of the stage on which the action of the day happens. So we want to set the stage so that it supports what we want to see happening. But the most important thing is what actually happens rather than how we've set up the environment itself. It is a complicated relationship though, because the way we set up the environment will actually shape what we do as well. So I think there's a lot of research which shows that children's behaviour is certainly impacted by the kind of environment they find themselves in. But I think the other interesting thing is the environment also really impacts us as educators. When we think about the environment, it's also important to think about more than just the physical space. Obviously, that's the key part that we see when we first enter an environment, but I think there are a number of other aspects we have to consider. So beyond the space itself, we also need to think about the environment as a relational space. So it's a space in which relationships happen, in which social connections happen. So we're thinking about it not just in terms of the arrangement of things in space, but we're thinking about how those affect the people in that space. And the other aspect that I don't think we always give enough consideration to is the way the environment is used over time. So the fact that an environment will be different depending on the time of day when we're looking at it, the way that we use it, how much time we spend in it. And when we're thinking about children's time in environments, one of the things that's really important for us to think about is how much time we're actually giving children to engage with their environment. If we're giving them very short, sharp sections of time, they'll probably engage in a very different way to if we're giving them much longer, extended blocks of time. Here at Mia, we place a particular importance on the environment that we provide for children. And I think right from the beginning of Mia, our philosophy has really been about trying very hard to avoid an institutional environment. So we don't want it to feel like a hospital or a clinic, to be cool and cold. We really want it to be a warm, welcoming environment and a very home-like environment as well. Obviously, we have 51 children a day. It's not possible for us to create a home as such. It's very rare to have a home with that many children. But what we're looking for is an environment that feels and reminds us of home. So as we look around the space here, I think what you'll see is some very careful choices about the kind of furnishings we use, the kind of decor that we have, which are very much more about creating the kind of feeling that you might find in a home. We're also sensitive to the cultural backgrounds of the children who come to Mia. So we have a lot of families from Asian backgrounds, from Chinese and Korean families in particular. So you'll notice that some of the furniture that we've chosen is very much around reflecting that cultural background in the kind of environment that we are providing. What we want is for people to feel comfortable in the space. So we also want a space that feels comfortable for adults as well as for children. But I think we all know that certain environments have a calming effect on us. Certain environments make us feel good when we enter them. So we want to think about an environment that, particularly for the children that we work with, but also for the adults and family members we work with and for ourselves, actually has a good feeling when we come into it. There are a few principles we'll talk about in terms of what might help to make an environment feel that way. One of the really important ones, I think, is firstly just an environment that's kind of calm and orderly. I think that really helps anyone in terms of just their feeling about themselves and the kind of the stimulus that you're getting from what's happening around you. Now, when we work with young children, a calm environment is not always the first thing that pops into our head when we think of, perhaps 50 children, perhaps 100 children in a space. But I think there are ways that we can work around that. And certainly for us at Mia, that's something we work really hard at. I think there's a lot there that we need to think about in terms of the kind of furnishings we're choosing, the kind of colours that we're choosing, the kind of colour palette that we're using, the way that we're arranging the space. Everything from lighting through to texture, through to, as we've said, colour becomes really important. So again, at Mia, one of the things we try to do is we try to have a very, I guess, a similar palette across all of the spaces. We like to use a lot of neutral colours. We don't want the environment to kind of be a really in-your-face kind of environment. We really want it to, sort of sit in the background and be that kind of comforting presence there rather than something that's really jumping out at you all the time. We use a lot of lamp light rather than necessarily sort of fluorescent lights because we know that the harshness of the light can make a real difference to that environment. The use of real furnishings, the kind of furnishings that you actually want to sit down on, that have a nice feel to them, they're comfortable, they look welcoming, they look inviting, is really important for us. So when the environment's not overstimulating, children have that chance to relax into it rather than feeling that they're constantly on edge or constantly waiting for something to happen. Because when we have a calm environment for adults as well, the adults in the space are able to be a calming influence too and really engage deeply with children. That certainly has a real impact on the whole environment and the feel of what's going on. So I think there are some things there that we can think about in terms of how do we create and help our environments to be as calm as possible. A sense of order is really important in that. So having things that have places to go so that it's easy to pack them away. It's easy to keep them in place. We need an environment that kind of has a lived-in beauty. We want it still to be a beautiful space for all of us, but we also want it to feel like it's a space that you could actually do something in. We order a lot of things by colour at Mia. We want to be sure that when children want something, they know where they can find it, and when they approach an area to play, it looks inviting and it looks welcoming. If it doesn't do that, then there's not a lot of incentive to want to do the kind of play that we're hoping to encourage children to engage in those spaces. So those are some of the things I think that we certainly think about in terms of creating an environment that will engage children. We have a real focus on children being outdoors as much as possible. We work very hard at keeping and maintaining our playground space or our garden space as a very natural space. I know that's not always possible for everybody, but I think the more natural elements and natural materials that you can have, you see how children respond to that. I think the fact that our playground space has lots of areas within it where children can find things to do really helps them to get engaged in what's happening around them so that they can really be, that sense of really being. So the environment really needs to have lots of things available for children at different levels. It might be spaces where children can be together. It might be smaller, quieter spaces where children can be alone or perhaps with one or two friends. A space for children in a group care environment actually needs to provide for a real range of needs, abilities, ages. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We also want to provide spaces that allow for different levels of engagement. So some children will want to be very actively engaged in what they're doing. Other children may want to be more passively engaged at different times. So we don't want to have a sort of single speed environment where everything has to be done at the same level. We really want to provide that variety where children can pick and choose how they enter and engage with play, and throughout the day they can pick and choose how they're responding to that environment in terms of how they're feeling as well. Predictability and consistency are really important, both in terms of the physical space, but also in terms of a predictable pattern or rhythm of the day. So again, that will be helped by the physical space that we provide in terms of the consistency of the space. I think often we imagine that children need constant novelty to keep them interested, but I actually think what we find is children learn much more deeply, they're much more engaged with what's going on when they have predictable resources that they're really familiar with. Obviously we have to choose good resources that bear coming back to time and time again. If you're choosing something that, some things are boring if you have them all the time, but if you're choosing the right kind of resources, and I'm thinking particularly of sort of open-ended resources, loose parts, the kind of things that can be used day after day, but do different things with them each time or do them in a more complex way. In terms of an environment that promotes familiarity and belonging, it's also important to think about what children bring to that environment. So obviously they bring themselves, but they might also bring favourite possessions. It might also be just be a space to put those possessions. So a locker that they know is their locker, a space where they know their belongings will be when they want them. I think it's really important to respect that from the child's point of view. So we certainly want to encourage that kind of, that kind of bringing of the child's own sort of world into our space as well. Because again, that's part of allowing the child to feel that this space is just as much theirs as it is ours. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. How do children have that voice in the space? How do they have that ability to have some say and control over that space in negotiation with the educators in the space as well? So I think if we want children to feel comfortable in our spaces, particularly when children are new to our spaces, it becomes really important that the adults who they trust and the adults who they're with feel comfortable in those spaces as well. Because children tend to, especially young children, really gauge their reactions to things around them from how their parents react to things. There's an idea called social referencing, where children are really looking to the sort of trusted adults in their environment to see how they're responding before they make a decision about how they're going to respond themselves. So we want to provide, as we said, first of all, an environment that is physically comfortable, but we also want to provide an environment that is socially comfortable. Again, at Mia, one of the things we really work very hard on in terms of our physical environment is a space that's welcoming for families, a space that reflects families' culture and their sort of homes and things they might, children and family members might be used to seeing at home, and also a level of comfort there where adults have somewhere comfortable to be as well as children. And I guess the thing there is to be really conscious of your context as well. I mean, our group of families here at Mia is going to be very different to a group of families at another early childhood setting. And so I think every setting really needs to have its own personality. You need to be really thinking about your context, the families and the children that you're working with, also the staff that are there, so that their personalities and their kind of home lives are coming through as well to an extent, so that you're creating an environment that feels comfortable in the setting that you're in. And I know you might be looking around at our environment and thinking, actually, that's not reflective at all of what our families are like or what their homes are like. And I think that's actually a really important thing to notice, because what works for us and for our families is going to be so context specific. That won't work in every situation. That's something you really need to consider. But I think it's an important one. We've looked, I think, at some of the strategies that we use here at Mia around creating environments that are welcoming and inviting for all. I think one of the key things is that we need to see the environment as the stage that we're setting. It's something that enables good practice to happen, but by itself, it's not the be all and end all. I think we can certainly all imagine environments, you might have the most beautifully resourced and provided environment, but if what's happening in that environment in terms of the interactions and relationships isn't up to what we would expect, then the child's experience of that is not going to be great. Equally, I think we can all perhaps picture environments that are not such great environments from a purely physical point of view, but we make up for that by the effort that the educators put in to make sure that they remain inviting and welcoming spaces. I think though what we're wanting really is the best of both worlds, and I think in the long term that's a more sustainable thing for us as educators. So I think see the environment definitely as the stage. It's a really important part of what you do, but don't forget that what actually happens on that stage is the most important part. And I guess I would just finish by saying to remember the context that you're in, that this is not saying that what we do here is the be all and end all and this is what everyone should be aspiring to. We're really saying this is one example of what we do that works in our particular context. The challenge now is for you to think about your own context and what's going to work best in that context for yourselves as educators, but also and most importantly perhaps for children and their families.